on the Pillard nomination upon reconsideration. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Cornelia T.L. Pillard of the District of Columbia to be United States Circuit Judge for the District of Columbia Circuit, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Cornelia T.L. Pillard of the District of Columbia to be United States Circuit Judge for the District of Columbia Circuit shall be brought to a close upon reconsideration? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso.
No. Shall be no.
Johnson, no. Coates, no. Johnson, no.
Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran,
You got me, so I'm good for the night.
Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Ms. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Sorono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, huh?
Might go back.
Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Markey, McCaskill, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Manchin, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, Wicker. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mrs. Murray, aye. Answer 42.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 56, the nays are 42. Upon reconsideration, the motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Cornelia T.L. Pillard of the District of Columbia to be United States Circuit Judge for the District of Columbia Circuit.
The senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S-1797, which was submitted earlier today, that the bill be read 3 times and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? The senator from North Dakota.
Mr. President, I want to reserve the right to object. I'm certainly willing to let the good senator make comments, but at this point I want to reserve the right to object.
Is there objection?
Object. Yes, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
The senator from Rhode Island.
First of all, I think it's appropriate to make some comments, and I appreciate certainly the senator from North Dakota being here and making the point. But we're at a juncture that within 2 weeks, 1.3 million Americans will lose their federal unemployment compensation insurance. It'll be a shock to them economically, and particularly, I think, since it'll be just a few days after the Christmas holidays. And my legislation is very simple. I'm seeking to extend for an additional year the unemployment compensation program that has been in place for several years, and that will allow 1.3 million Americans to have some support as they face a very difficult economy. Now, we've asked as Democrats that this UI proposal be part of the budget negotiations. Our colleagues in the House of Representatives have made the same request. It appears that that will not be the case, so that we have to seek a standalone legislative vehicle, and that's why I proposed the legislation as I've done today. What we are effectively doing, and what we have to do within 2 weeks, so it doesn't allow us to time the procedural process of the committee deliberation and markups, et cetera, what we have to do is try to avoid a huge economic shock to 1.3 million Americans immediately. There'll be more after that. But as of December 31st or January 1st, if you are on unemployment benefits, federal benefits, extended benefits, you lose them. In my state, that's 4,900 people celebrating New Year's Day by losing their federal unemployment insurance benefits. And families who are struggling to just keep their heads above water in a very difficult economy, who have seen their jobs disappear, who have, after years of dedicated work, find themselves now looking in very difficult circumstances for employment in my home state particularly, but not my home state alone. So we have to act, and that's why we're here this evening to ask for immediate consideration, not further and further review, but immediate consideration. I think it's important to note out that the average weekly benefit is about $300 per week. This is not a program that people are using to enrich themselves by any means. This is basically keeping the heat on, keeping some food on the table, maybe keeping the rent paid. This is a program also that people only qualify for after working and establishing a work history. So for all these reasons, we're not talking about some lavish benefit that's a windfall to Americans. This is something that's going to keep families together. And that's why I think we have to be willing, beginning this evening, to get this program extended through next year at least. There's another aspect to this, too. Unemployment insurance is one of the best counter-cyclical economic programs that we have with federal fiscal policy. The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates that with the expiration of UI, if we do not act, it will cost our economy next year 200,000 jobs. It will cost us jobs if we don't act. And it will slow economic growth by about 0.2% is their estimate. So not only is this sensible, in fact, the decent thing to do for millions of families, it's a smart thing to do for our economy. Because if we don't do it, we're literally seeing, under very rational estimates, 200,000 jobs disappear. And what's the one thing everybody claims we need to do in this country right now? Put more people back to work. Now, this extension has been scored at about at $26 billion for the year. Traditionally, we have treated unemployment insurance as an emergency expenditure, and we haven't offset it. That tradition has been abandoned recently, and we've had to come up with offsets. But there are offsets. There are tax loops. There are provisions that encourage companies to move jobs overseas that we can close and pay for this. There are other provisions that would stop subsidizing significant multi-million-dollar corporate benefits so that American families could have a chance. So we can do this if we have to, but we've got to do it. Now, these loopholes that we've talked about and many of my colleagues talked about, they should be closed anyway. But if it helps pay for unemployment insurance, well, that's not only good, that's something that would be a very positive step forward. We need, not only for the individual families, but for the overall economy to extend these benefits. And we have to start immediately. We're running out of time. We have just 2 weeks. And nothing's more important than getting people back to work. And as I said, if we don't do this, we're going to see 200,000 jobs that are going to be foregone in the next year. So this is about jobs as well as about keeping families together and keeping them able to provide for their basic needs. It's pro-growth, it's smart, and I hope we can come together and do it. And I hope, again, that I appreciate certainly the senator from North Dakota's objection, but I hope we can find a way to not object but to move forward together. The benefits cut across party lines. If you look at the states that are suffering the most, and as we all know, the unemployment compensation program is a tiered program. It depends upon the level of unemployment in your state. But if you look at the states that are suffering the most, and unfortunately I'm going to have to say Rhode Island is one of them. Nevada has the highest unemployment rate, 9.3. We're right behind them, 9.2%. It has been 5 long years of unemployment. It's come down from above 10%, but it's still much, much high. But this is not a regional phenomenon. Illinois, 8.9% unemployment. Mississippi, 8.5% unemployment. Kentucky, 8.4% unemployment. North Carolina, 8% unemployment. Georgia, 8.1% unemployment. Arizona, 8.2% unemployment. These are tough numbers, and it's not concentrated in one place. It is across this entire country. This is not a red issue or a blue issue. This is an American issue for workers who've worked and now can't find jobs and need support. And there's something else I think that's important to mention, and that is we've seen some progress on the work front. The last report showed that we've actually grew last month 203,000 jobs. That's the good news. The bad news is despite this improvement, long-term unemployment remains high. More than 4 million workers, 30% 37% of those who are unemployed were jobless for 27 weeks or longer in November. So what we're seeing is some short-term movement, but the longer-term unemployed, the ones who qualify for the federal benefits, they're still finding it virtually, well, very difficult, if not impossible, to find work. And that's exactly what this federal program is designed to assist. Those long-term unemployed that are in an environment, in a state where the economy is not working as well as some other states. There are some states that are doing exceptionally well, and I'm glad for them. But there are many, as I indicated before, who are experience unacceptably high unemployment rates. This program started to take shape in its most recent incarnation in June of 2008, when President George W. Bush signed the program into law for the extension of unemployment benefits for this cycle over these several years. When he did it, the unemployment rate was 5.6%, and the average duration of unemployment was 17.1 weeks. So we're looking now at a situation that nationally and in many states, it is much higher than when we initiated the program back in 2008. Now is not the time to stop. And in order to get this done, we have to move expeditiously. There is not time for elaborate hearings. There is not time for conferences with the House. The House is proposing to leave this Friday. We have to move immediately. Today, our national unemployment rate is 7%. The duration of unemployment is 37.2 weeks. That's 7% compared to 5.6 and 37 weeks compared to 17 weeks. We still need this program to help the families of this nation. We can't end it now. We have to move forward, particularly in the holiday season. The reality, and let me finally make the point, is that people will be looking at a new year coming with the reality is that what little benefit they're getting because they can't find a job, average $300 a week, is going. That's a tough reality to look at your family on New Year's Day and understand that you don't have those resources. We have to act. I hope we can. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor to my colleague.
The senator from North Dakota.
Mr. President, I objected earlier. I want to express my appreciation to the good senator from Rhode Island. I understand his concerns and want to take a minute just to explain the objection that we have. I don't think anyone in the chamber that there's anyone in this chamber that's indifferent to the plight of the long-term unemployed. However, this legislation falls under the jurisdiction of the Senate Finance Committee. And as of yet, the committee has not had the opportunity to consider it. And there are a number of concerns that members on our side of the aisle have with the legislation, most notably the price tag. According to the CBO, a full one-year extension of the Emergency Unemployment Compensation Program would cost $25 billion for a single year. That's the cost of this bill, and the bill contains no offsets to cover that cost. So the Senate Finance Committee needs to have an opportunity to consider this legislation to find a way to pay for it. In addition, the committee needs to have an opportunity to consider alternatives rather than simply providing additional benefits to the unemployed, hopefully coming up with something that really helps them get back to work. Republicans are willing to consider such ideas and need to have an opportunity to do so through the committee process. And it's on that basis that I object to my colleague's unanimous consent request. And again, I thank you for the time and the courtesy of my colleague.
Mr. President.
The senator from Rhode Island.
I certainly respect my colleague from North Dakota, his sincerity, principled position. I think we both can agree on one thing. We've got to start moving very quickly because this reality is dawning very rapidly upon 1.3 million Americans. And I hope we can move together. Mr. President.
The senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do hope that we can resolve the issue that my colleagues were just raising. It's an important one for the country. We're very blessed, however, in Louisiana to have a relatively low unemployment rate because our economy is doing so well in large measure because of the extraordinary new technologies, which I think you understand as well in Indiana, being used to discover oil and gas, and particularly natural gas, in places and in ways we never thought possible, and it's creating a real resurgence of manufacturing in our state that's benefiting not only us and our neighbors along the Gulf Coast, but it's benefiting states all over America. And the economic numbers, despite the great challenges we have here in the Congress on our budget, on paying down our debt, on reducing our annual deficit, on procedural measures, how to run this Senate and work more effectively on behalf of the people of all of our states, there's some really good news in North Dakota, in South Dakota, Texas, Louisiana, and other states that are experiencing really very low numbers of unemployment because the jobs are plentiful. What our challenge is, just to comment briefly, what our challenge is actually training the workforce that we're going to need to fill all the jobs that we have. And these are very good paying jobs, some starting at $40,000 or $60,000 a year, construction, welders going up to $125,000. Some of them are temporary, but many of them will be permanent. So I hope we can resolve this unemployment issue. However, in states like Senator from Rhode Island, unfortunately, he and about 20 other states have very high unemployment. I think in some states it might still be over 9%. And they're chronically unemployed just because of the competition of globalization and other things. So I think we have to try to find a way to work together as a nation. We're blessed to have relatively low unemployment, but we have a big job skills training gap that we're working on in our state. But I wanted to rise today to actually talk for just a few minutes about a very important bill that the House just passed by an extraordinary vote of 346 to 1. And my colleague, Congressman Boustany in the House was the lead sponsor, and I want to really congratulate him for extraordinary work on this particular bill. It's something that he and I have worked together across party lines. He's a Republican, I'm a Democrat, but we've worked very closely together to try to, A, get this entire bill passed, not only for the benefit of Louisiana, which is shaded here as one of the states that will benefit, but you can see how many other states between 2013 and 2017 will be affected positively by the passage of this bill. The bill is the Veterans Affairs Major Medical Facility Lease Authorization Act. That's a mouthful, but it does an it takes an important action. It basically uses the guidance of the Office of Management and Budget, a letter we received from them at my request, and formulated into a piece of legislation that will allow the Veterans Administration to build clinics the way they have been building clinics for our veterans who really need the highest and best quality care using a lease arrangement. The reason that we had to pass this bill, and I'm going to be working with Senator Vitter and many others to ask unanimous consent at the proper time for this bill to pass through our Senate over here, is because about 6 years ago there was an administrative ruling that basically stopped the ability of the Veterans Department to be able to build these very needed veterans clinics by using a lease. Internally, the administration just decided to score it differently, and that threw lots of sand in the gears. And those gears have been stuck for 6 years. And in our state, veterans in Lafayette and in Lake Charles have been waiting and waiting and waiting. Now, we had some added complications, which the Veterans Administration has taken the blame for. The bid process that was used initially for Our clinic, one of our clinics was defective and they had to throw it out. But the end of this sad story is that a great bill passed the House of Representatives just literally a few hours ago. And I wanted to come to the floor to say how proud I am of Congressman Boustany and his dogged pursuit of justice, because his district is in this part of the state where these two clinics will be built in Lafayette and Lake Charles. And so I have worked closely with him, as has Senator Vitter, to make sure that we brought some clarity and focus to this to move forward. But as the bill moved through to help us with our problem, it also is going to help many, many states that are scheduled for veterans clinics. I want to also thank Congressman Miller from Florida, who's the chair of the VA committee. He worked very closely with Congressman Boustany. And I want to thank Bernie Sanders, our senator from Vermont, who chairs our committee here. And Senator Sanders, whose desk this is actually, has been very, very supportive of this effort. And while I'm not going to ask unanimous consent at this moment, he and I have had a discussion earlier today about how strongly he supports this effort and how much he wants to help us get this done. There are 27 clinics in 22 states. This process, or nightmare, I should say, began in Louisiana about 6 years ago. 4 years ago, the ruling was made, but our legislation that was passed in the House will override that basically and set us on a course that's both fiscally responsible and so important to our veterans to honor the promises we made to them for clinics to be close where they can access them. They're not driving hundreds of miles for regular care. And we can be very smart, I think, Mr. President, in the way we design these leases so it'll be a benefit to the taxpayer, a benefit to the veterans, and will really meet our obligation to them. So again, the bill just passed the House. I will be asking unanimous consent along with Senator Vitter tomorrow to move this bill, get it to the President's desk, get it signed, so that the veterans that have been waiting, particularly in our state for so long, will have even something extra to celebrate this very special Christmas holiday. So I thank the President. I yield the floor, suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent to call the quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, a couple years ago, I surprised everyone, but I didn't surprise myself when I selected as chair of the Super Committee Patty Murray. Patty at the time was chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee. She was a member of the Budget Committee, and I thought she would do a remarkably good job because I have such faith in her integrity, her temperament, her wisdom, and her ability to get things done. And the country should be so pleased with the work that she was able to do on a bipartisan basis with Paul Ryan. It's really a kind of an unconventional pair that worked together to come up with a budget that we can work on for 2 years. We have numbers now. I'm very pleased that budget negotiators Murray and Ryan have come up with an agreement today that will roll back the painful and arbitrary cuts of sequester and prevent another costly government shutdown. I again commend Budget Committee Chairman Patty Murray for making this agreement possible. But it's also fair to, and I hope this doesn't get him in trouble in the House, to say that Chairman Ryan also worked hard on this. It was a compromise. We didn't get what we wanted. They didn't get what they wanted. But that's what legislation is all about, working together. Compromise is not a bad word. We believed all along that Congress should set sound fiscal policy through the regular order of the budget process and not through hostage-taking or crisis-making. So we'll have a lot more to say about this in the days to come, but this is a good day for our country. I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed now to approve the morning business. Senators allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent that we proceed to H.R. 2922.
Clerk will report.
H.R. 2922, an act to extend the authority of the Supreme Court Police to protect court officials away from the Supreme Court grounds.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be read 3 times passed. The motion reconsidered be laid on the table. There will be no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to H.R. 2871.
The clerk will report.
H.R. 2871, an act to amend Title 28 United States Code, and so forth and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be read a 3rd time passed. The motion reconsidered be laid on the table. Any statements relating to this matter appear in the record as if given.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to S.Res. 315.
The clerk will report.
S.Res. 315, to authorize production of records by the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, the motions reconsidered be laid on the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Yes, 1797, introduced earlier by Senator Reid, I'm told is at the desk due for a first reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the first time.
S. 1797, a bill to provide for the extension of certain unemployment benefits and for other purposes.
I didn't make it clear, Mr. President. This is Reid of Rhode Island that did this. I now ask for a second reading, but object to my own request.
Objection having been heard, the bill will receive its second reading on the next legislative day.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes the business day adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow, December 11th, following the prayer and the pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the adjournment proceedings be approved to date. Time for the 2 leaders be reserved for the use later in the day. Following any leader remarks, the Senate proceed to executive session and resume consideration of the executive calendar number 233, the nomination of Cornelia Pillard to be United States Circuit Judge for the District of Columbia post-closure. Further, the time during adjournment count post-closure.
Without objection.
Upon the use or getting back of post-closure time, the Senate will proceed to vote on confirmation of Pillard nomination. If all time is used, the vote will occur around 1 a.m. Thursday morning, December 12th. Senators will be notified when the vote is scheduled. There's no further business come before the Senate. I ask that it adjourn under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow.
The U.S. Senate taking up and approving several of President Obama's nominees today. Patricia Millett was confirmed as a judge on the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, filling a seat that has been vacant since 2005. The Senate also voted to limit debate on Nina Pillard's nomination to fill one of the other two open seats on that court. The Senate today also approved Mel Watt's nomination to head the Federal Housing Finance Agency. The Democratic congressman was tapped by President Obama in May to lead the agency that regulates mortgage financiers Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The final vote was 57 to 41, with 2 Republicans voting in favor. The Senate back in Wednesday, and as always, watch live coverage of the Senate right here on C-SPAN 2.